The moment I saw my director crying alone in the parking garage, I almost kept walking. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of late that makes the fluorescent lights feel cruel. And I had spent the last 14 hours trying to save a product launch that was falling apart faster than I could patch it. I was exhausted in that specific way where your feet stop hurting because they've gone numb, and all I wanted was my car, the highway, and 30 minutes of bad radio before I collapsed into bed. But then I saw her and I stopped. Victoria Langford was standing next to a concrete pillar on the second level of the parking structure, still in her blazer, one hand pressed flat against the wall like she needed it to stay upright. Her shoulders were moving in a way I recognized but had never seen on her. She was crying, not politely, not discreetly, actually crying. I want to be honest about who Victoria was to me at that point, because context matters. For 18 months I had worked under her at Halcyon Systems, a mid-sized software company based outside of Austin, and in that time I had assembled a fairly clear picture of her, precise, demanding, impossible to impress, and completely uninterested in whether you liked her. She had built the product development division from 11 people to nearly 60 in 4 years, and she ran it like someone who believed that momentum was the only thing standing between success and collapse. She pushed hard. She expected more than you thought you had, and if you weren't keeping up, she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a malfunctioning component she was considering replacing. I was 28 years old when I joined Halcyon, fresh off a 2-year stint at a startup that had burned bright, and then imploded spectacularly when we lost our Series B funding. I had taken the Halcyon job because it felt stable, because my savings were down to 4 months of runway, and because my mother had started calling more often in that particular way she had when she was worried, but trying not to say it. I was not exactly arriving with confidence. My name is James Calloway, and I grew up in a small town in central Georgia called Milledgeville, where my father drove a school bus for 22 years, and my mother worked as a bookkeeper for a family-owned hardware store. They were good people, steady people. They taught me to show up on time, do what you said you'd do, and not complain about hard work. That upbringing got me through engineering school at Georgia Tech on a combination of merit scholarships and weekend shifts at a sandwich shop. It did not, however, prepare me for Victoria Langford. The first 6 months at Halcyon were brutal in a way I hadn't anticipated. My previous company had been chaotic but warm. People shouted at each other during sprints and then brought donuts the next morning. Halcyon was different. The culture there was professional in a way that left no room for personality, and Victoria set the tone from the top. She reviewed every major deliverable herself. She sent notes at midnight and expected replies by 7 a.m. She asked questions during presentations that weren't really questions. They were excavations, designed to find exactly the spot where your thinking had gotten lazy, or your research had gotten thin. I kept waiting for some sign that she saw something in me, a word of encouragement, a small acknowledgement that I was doing well. It never came. What came instead were corrections, follow-up requests, and once memorably, a meeting invite that simply said, "Your framework. We need to discuss," with nothing else in the body. That was a bad afternoon. By the time month 7 rolled around, I had started keeping a document on my laptop titled Next Steps that wasn't really about next steps. It was a draft, a resignation letter, half-written, that I kept returning to and revising the way you pick at something that hasn't healed. I hadn't sent it. I hadn't even finished it. But I knew it was there, and sometimes knowing it was there was the only thing that made the harder days feel manageable. Like having an emergency exit you never intended to use but needed to know existed. I'd been adding to that document the night before the company's annual product summit, Halcyon's internal showcase event, where every team presented their roadmap to the full company and a handful of invited clients. It was the biggest internal event of the year. The catering alone cost more than I made in a month. Victoria had been preparing for it for 6 weeks, and the pressure in our division had been climbing steadily toward something that didn't yet have a name. What none of us knew going into that week was that something had already broken. Not in the product, in the company itself. I found out later, piecing it together from things Victoria told me and things I overheard in subsequent weeks. Halcyon had been in quiet negotiations with a larger firm about a strategic partnership, the kind that would have taken us from mid-size to serious player in about 18 months. The deal had been close enough that the board had started making internal plans, and then, 3 days before the summit, the other company pulled out, not because of anything Halcyon did wrong, but because they had received a competing offer from a different acquisition target that better fit their timeline. It was the kind of loss that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with timing, which somehow made it worse. Victoria had known since that morning. She had spent the entire summit day presenting to clients and employees, with the news sitting inside her like something she couldn't put down. She had smiled through keynotes. She had feeled about product roadmap with her usual precision. She had done everything that was expected of her with the same composed authority that people had come to depend on. And then at 11:30 p.m., when the venue had emptied and the catering staff were breaking down the last of the tables, she had walked to her car, sat down on a concrete parking block, and finally let herself feel it. That was when I found her. I should have kept walking. I almost did. But I'd like to think I stopped because my parents raised me to notice when someone needed help. It's more honest to say I stopped because something about the way she was standing, that open palm against the wall like she was bracing herself, made it impossible to pretend I hadn't seen. I said her name. Just that. Victoria. She turned fast, and for a second her face did the thing I imagine everyone's face does when they're caught being human by the wrong person at the wrong time. A flash of something. Panic, maybe, or shame, and then she straightened up and reached for the mask she'd been wearing all day. But it didn't quite fit back the way it had before. Her eyes were red, and her voice, when she finally spoke, came out with a roughness that no amount of composure was going to smooth over. She told me she was fine. Of course she did. I told her I could see that, and something about the flatness in my voice made her stop reaching for the mask. There was a long pause. In parking garages at midnight, when you're that tired and that wrung out, you lose some of the usual social calculations. I stopped trying to figure out the appropriate professional response and just stood there. And then I did something I still can't fully explain. I sat down on the concrete block next to the one she'd been using, and I said nothing. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. I probably deserved that, but she sat back down. We stayed like that for a while. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system and, somewhere on a lower level, someone's car starting and pulling out slowly. The fluorescent light above us buzzed once, flickered, and steadied. I didn't push. I didn't ask questions. I had spent a decade and a half being told that men don't sit with discomfort well, that we fix things or flee from them, and I suppose I was trying to prove that wrong. Or maybe I was just too tired to do either. When she finally talked, it came out slowly. She didn't give me the full picture all at once. That came later, in pieces, over the following weeks. But she told me enough. She told me that something she had spent years building toward was gone, that the people who depended on the division she ran didn't know yet, that the next few months were going to be the hardest thing she'd ever managed professionally, and that she had no idea if she was going to be able to do it. I noticed something as she talked. She didn't speak the way she did in meetings, precise, purposeful, each sentence arriving like a decision. She spoke like someone thinking out loud, which I had never once heard from her. She circled back on herself. She let sentences trail off. She said, "I don't know," twice, which I realized was something I had genuinely never heard her say before. What struck me wasn't the vulnerability. It was that underneath it, even in that state, she was still thinking about the team, about how to protect people from the worst of the fallout, about which clients needed personal calls in the morning, about who in the division would take the news hardest and what they'd need. Even while she was falling apart, her mind was working on everyone else's landing. I told her I hadn't planned to still be in this building at midnight. She gave me a small, exhausted sound that might have been a laugh, and then, because honesty has a way of arriving when you stop guarding yourself, I told her something I hadn't planned to say either. I told her that I had been close to quitting, that there had been a period, not that long ago, where I had genuinely believed she thought I was a mistake, that I had started wondering if the right thing to do was to find somewhere else before she made that decision for me. The quiet that followed felt different from the earlier silence. Denser. Then she said, "I know." I looked at her. She said she had seen the document. Not on purpose. She had been looking for a client file on the shared drive 3 days ago and had accidentally opened the wrong folder. She had seen the file name and, before she understood what she was doing, read the first few lines. She had closed it immediately. But she knew what it was. The air in that parking garage felt very still. She didn't look at me when she said the next part. She looked at the concrete wall across from us, at the painted number on the pillar that said B2, at nothing in particular. She said she had been harder on me than on most of the team. She said it wasn't because she thought I was lacking. It was because she thought I wasn't. She had been pushing me towards something she could see more clearly than I could, and somewhere in the push she had forgotten to show me what she was pushing toward. She called it a failure of communication. She said it quietly, like it cost her something. Then she looked at me directly, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in 18 months of working with her. Not tears. She had moved past that, but something open and unguarded that made her look for the first time, like someone I actually knew rather than someone I worked for. She said, "Please don't go. I know I haven't given you a reason to stay, but I'm asking you anyway. I want to say something clean happened next, that I made a decision in that moment, said the right thing, and we walked out of that garage with everything resolved. That isn't how it went. What actually happened is that I sat there for a while longer, processing, and then I told her I wasn't going anywhere that night, which was true and also the only honest thing I could offer right then. She nodded. That was enough. We left separately. She took the elevator. I took the stairs because I needed the movement. I drove home with the radio off, which I never do, and I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I did not sleep well. But I did not open the document either. The next few months are not easy to summarize, which is itself part of the truth. What happened at Halcyon after the partnership collapsed was brutal in the specific way that institutional restructuring is brutal. Not violent, but grinding. There were department reviews. There were client meetings where everyone in the room knew the subtext and no one said it. There was 1 week in March where I didn't leave the office before 9 p.m. a single night, and there were 2 days I'm not sure I ate an actual meal at any point. But things had shifted. Victoria still demanded precision. She still sent emails at strange hours and expected you to have thought through problems before bringing them to her. She was not, suddenly, a warm and approachable person. What changed was something more subtle. She started being explicit about why a report needed to be restructured, why a client conversation needed a different tone, why a timeline mattered beyond the deadline itself. She had always known these things, but she had carried them alone, assuming everyone else could see what she saw. She stopped assuming. She also started asking simple questions, mostly. What do you need from me on this? Or, is there a part of this you think we're getting wrong? She asked them in the matter-of-fact way she did everything, without softness. But she actually listened to the answers. You could tell because the next conversation showed evidence that she had. The team noticed. It's hard to describe the before and after, precisely. It wasn't like a light being switched on. It was more like a room that had always been a little cold, gradually becoming a reasonable temperature. People didn't change overnight, but they stopped flinching when she walked in. They started finishing each other's sentences in meetings instead of going quiet and deferring. The output got better, which probably sounds like the least emotional measure of something human, but at Halcyon, where everything eventually showed up in the roadmap or the metrics, it was real, stayed. I want to be clear about what that decision looked like at the actual moment I made it, because I think the honest version matters more than the clean version. I didn't make it all at once in a parking garage. I made it incrementally, over the following weeks, every time I got in my car at night instead of going home to open that document. At some point, I noticed I hadn't thought about it in a while. At some point after that, I deleted it. What Victoria and I built, professionally, over the 18 months that followed that, and something I'm proud of in a way that still surprises me a little. She gave me the lead on a product initiative that became one of Halcyon's 3 core growth drivers over the next fiscal year. She put my name on things. She disagreed with me in meetings in front of other people and then, sometimes, came back to my desk an hour later and said she'd been wrong. That last part was rarer, but it happened, and every time it did, it meant more than she probably knew. She's still demanding. She still has a way of looking at a deliverable that makes you want to do it over even when you were proud of it 5 minutes ago. The things that made her hard to work for haven't disappeared. They've just become easier to understand. When you know that someone's exacting nature comes from the same place as their loyalty, from the same place as that midnight conversation in a parking garage where she sat on a concrete block and asked someone she'd never been warm to please not leave, it changes the math. I've thought a lot about that night since then, about what might have happened if I'd kept walking, which I almost did. I would have sent the resignation letter. That's not dramatic speculation. I was close enough to the edge that one more frustrating week would have been enough. I would have found another job, probably a decent one. I would have looked back on Victoria Langford as the demanding boss who drove me out of an otherwise good company, and she would have lost someone she apparently believed in enough to rebuild around, which seems like a loss on both ends even if neither of us would have known it. There is something strange and humbling about the realization that people are carrying more than you can see. I had spent 18 months constructing a story about Victoria, what she thought of me, what she wanted from me, what her distance meant. I had built that story carefully, using real evidence, and I had been wrong about almost all of it. Not about the facts, about the meaning. I think about that sometimes when I'm managing people now. I was promoted into a team lead role last spring, and I have 5 people reporting to me who are all newer to the industry than I was when I almost quit. I think about what version of me they might be constructing. I try to close the gap between what I see in them and what I tell them I see. I don't always succeed, but I try harder than I would have if I hadn't learned what it looks like when that gap gets too wide. Victoria told me something, maybe 6 months after that night, during a rare quiet moment at the end of a long project debrief. She said that leadership has a way of making you feel like the walls you put up are the same thing as the standards you hold. That it takes someone sitting down next to you in an empty parking garage to show you the difference. She said it like she was observing something from a careful distance. But I had seen enough of her by then to know that careful distance was just how she got close to things that mattered. I used to think the story of that night was about what I did, that I stayed, that I showed up, that I didn't keep walking. I've come to think it was more about what she did. She let someone see her. After years of building a reputation on being the person who didn't need anything from anyone, she sat down, stayed put, and asked. Just asked. That's not a small thing. For some people, it might be the hardest thing they ever do. I still work at Halcyon. The division Victoria built is now one of the company's most profitable units, and she was named to the executive leadership team last fall. She sent me a message the morning the announcement went out. It was 3 words. Don't forget B2. That's the number of the parking level. I laughed out loud at my desk, which is not something I do often enough. I don't know what the right lesson is, or if there's one clean version. What I know is that kindness is rarely as costly as we imagine and almost always worth more than we expect. And sometimes the difference between a life you almost left and one you end up being proud of is as thin as the decision to stop instead of walk.